Think about it for a moment. Just 4 weeks ago, the United States and its ally Israel launched military strikes against Iran, killed its supreme leader, and now the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, calmly says that Washington can achieve victory without putting troops on Iranian soil. And while he says that, the Pentagon is moving thousands of Marines, positioning the 82nd Airborne Division, and making concrete plans for possible ground operations. Doesn't that sound contradictory? Because it certainly does to me. And when there's such a big gap between what's said and what's done, you have to ask, who are they really talking to? The American people, the financial markets, or are they simply trying to buy time while the entire world pays the price of a war that no one in the Middle East asked for? That's exactly what we're going to explore today, with real data and real consequences, because you deserve the truth, not the official script. Let's start with the basics, with what we actually know for certain. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint military operations against Iran. The operations included the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, which triggered an immediate Iranian response through missile and drone attacks against U.S. military bases, Israeli territory, and other Gulf states. That's a fact, not an opinion. From that moment, the world entered territory we haven't seen since the 1970s. What followed wasn't just a military clash between two countries. It was a global economic crisis that still hasn't ended, one that directly affects every family in this country, including millions of Latino families in the United States who are now paying more for gas, more for food, and watching their wages fall behind as inflation eats them up. Now, there's something we need to understand before anything else: geography. Because in this story, geography is everything. The Strait of Hormuz is the most critical maritime passage in the world for oil and natural gas trade. 27% of global seaborne crude oil passes through that narrow corridor between Iran and Oman, nearly a third of the world's oil. And when Iran effectively shut down that strait, through attacks on commercial ships and the mass withdrawal of maritime insurers, the entire world felt the shock at once. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026, for the first time in 4 years, reaching a peak of $126. That's not an abstract number. It translates into more expensive gasoline, more expensive food, higher heating costs, everything becoming more expensive for families that were already at their financial limit. This is where the official narrative starts to fall apart. The Trump administration and its closest allies in Congress claimed the war was necessary, a matter of national security, a firm response to Iran's nuclear ambitions. Maybe that's debatable, but the numbers are not. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation caused by the war as the greatest global energy security challenge in history, not in the last 10 or 20 years, but ever. And that statement came from the top authority monitoring global energy, not a political critic or opposition voice. So now we have to ask the question that major media outlets avoid: who benefits from all of this? Because in economics and geopolitics, when something this big happens, there are always winners and losers, and the winners are not always who you'd expect. Trump also temporarily eased sanctions on Russia in hopes of increasing supply, but this handed Moscow roughly $150 million per day in additional revenue, with little visible effect on global oil prices. Did you catch that? To try to lower the oil prices caused by this war, the United States effectively gave Russia $150 million a day, the same Russia that is supposedly Washington's #1 strategic adversary, the same country whose war in Ukraine the U.S. has spent years trying to contain. That's not a policy mistake. That's a structural contradiction, one that only makes sense if you understand that the interests of capital and the interests of ordinary people rarely align. Because look at what's happening at the same time. The Hormuz crisis is materially improving Russia's competitive position in global crude oil markets. With Middle Eastern supplies disrupted, both India and China have strong incentives to deepen their reliance on Russian oil. Do you understand what that means? The war the United States launched to weaken Iran is, ironically and systematically, strengthening Russia. Meanwhile, gasoline prices in California have surged past record levels in the first weeks of the war. Workers who commute long distances, families forced to choose between filling their tank or buying food. These are not abstract collateral victims. They are direct and concrete victims of decisions made in Washington without their input. Now let's go back to what Rubio said, that the United States can achieve its objectives without ground troops. He stated that while troops are being deployed to the region to give Trump maximum flexibility to adjust strategy. Maximum flexibility. That's diplomatic language for, we don't know what we're going to do, but we want to keep all options open. And in the context of an active war, a closed strategic strait disrupting the global economy, soaring oil prices, and inflation hitting the most vulnerable, this isn't a strategy. It's improvisation dressed up as national security. Even Trump's own Republican allies are saying it. Some prominent members of Congress have told him he could frame the war as a success once the military achieves the objectives outlined by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Pentagon briefings, such as destroying Iran's navy. Iran, its missile capabilities, and its industrial base. Declare victory and withdraw. That's what some of his closest allies are urging him to do, because they know, just as we do, that sending ground troops into Iran would mean stepping into a quagmire that would be extremely difficult to escape. It would mean repeating the mistakes of Iraq and Afghanistan, but in a much larger country, with a far bigger population, more complex geography, and decades of accumulated resentment toward foreign intervention. And here we need to talk about something conventional analysts rarely mention: history. Iran is not just any country in the collective memory of the Middle East. It has more than 80 million people, an ancient culture, mountains, deserts, massive cities, and something military planners in Washington sometimes fail to calculate: a deeply rooted national narrative of resistance to foreign intervention. That narrative dates back to the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, when the CIA and the British government organized a coup to protect Western oil interests. That's not propaganda. It's documented in declassified archives. That defining moment in Iran's modern history helps explain why its government, despite its brutality and internal contradictions, retains a degree of popular legitimacy when it comes to resisting foreign pressure. So when Washington says it can achieve victory without ground troops, we have to ask, by what means? What exactly is the objective? If the objective was to destroy Iran's nuclear program, there's a very concrete problem. The International Atomic Energy Agency stated that while Iran has an ambitious nuclear program and has refused inspections of damaged sites since the 2025 conflict, there was no clear evidence of a structured nuclear weapons program when the 2026 war began. No active weapons program was confirmed. The materials exist, yes. The facilities exist, yes. But the structured weapons program used as the public justification for war was not clearly established, even according to the UN agency responsible for monitoring it. There's also another serious technical issue that has barely been mentioned. Some nuclear material is buried in underground facilities, and if ground forces or airstrikes directly hit those sites, the risk of radioactive contamination is real. If those facilities were struck during military operations, contamination would be a real possibility. According to IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi, this is not a minor detail. It's an existential risk for the entire region. While all this unfolds at the diplomatic and military level, the economic situation continues to deteriorate in ways that affect real people in real countries. U.S. officials and Wall Street analysts are now considering the possibility that oil prices could surge to an unprecedented $200 per barrel. $200. Think about that. At that level, we're talking about a global economic crisis of historic proportions, a global recession, developing countries unable to import energy, and a food crisis, because fertilizers also pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The Fertilizer Institute reported that nearly 50% of global exports of urea and sulfur, as well as 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, a key input for nitrogen fertilizers, move through that strait. Half of the world's urea and sulfur supply depends on that route. Without fertilizers, there is no large-scale agricultural production. And without large-scale agricultural production, food prices surge worldwide. This isn't theory. It's basic chemistry and logistics. This is where the conversation has to expand to include a broader context. What's happening with Iran cannot be understood in isolation. It's part of a much deeper geopolitical realignment. People talk about a China, Russia, North Korea, Iran axis, but that's an oversimplification. These countries share few interests beyond resisting U.S. power and evading sanctions, even though they are increasingly cooperating. That's important. They are not allies in the traditional sense. They don't share a common ideology or a unified civilizational project. What unites them is their rejection of American hegemony. And when Washington acts militarily in ways the world perceives as unilateral or disproportionate, it pushes more countries toward that bloc, not because they admire Russia or China, but because they distrust the United States. The economic impact of the war also has a crucial domestic dimension, especially for Latino families in the United States. Interest rates have risen as well. The 10-year Treasury yield jumped to 4.6%, its highest level since July 2025. The 30-year mortgage rate climbed to 6.38% on March 26th. More expensive mortgages and higher borrowing costs mean that for any family trying to buy a home, the situation becomes even more difficult. For families already paying adjustable-rate mortgages, the impact can be immediate and severe. And that's not the result of irresponsibility on their part. It's a direct consequence of foreign policy decisions made far removed from their daily realities. There's something else that needs to be said clearly. In modern warfare, the narrative of victory is often a political construction, not a reflection of reality. This week, Trump rejected what he called negative media coverage of the operation's successes, criticizing reports that highlight the costs of the war. That's exactly what every government does during wartime. It's not unique to Trump or to the United States. It's the logic of power. When a war doesn't go as planned, when the costs are higher than publicly acknowledged, the first instinct is not transparency. It's control of the narrative. Power means controlling the narrative, saying battles are being won, saying the enemy is weakening, saying victory is near. And while those claims are being made, oil prices remain high. Marines continue moving into the region, and financial markets begin pricing in scenarios that governments still refuse to acknowledge publicly. The emerging view among oil industry executives and analysts is that the economic and market consequences of the war could escalate sharply if the Strait of Hormuz is not reopened within the next 1 to 3 weeks. That's the critical window. Beyond that point, the damage could become structural, leaving long-term scars on global markets, supply chains, and food prices that could take years to heal. That brings us to a question few are willing to ask in positions of power. Who is going to pay the price? The answer, as it so often is in the history of capitalism, is predictable. It won't be defense contractors selling missiles and bombs at record prices. It won't be hedge funds that placed perfectly timed bets on rising oil prices. An investigation found that $580 million was wagered on falling oil prices in the stock market through futures sales made just 15 minutes before Donald Trump announced a delay in attacks on Iran for negotiations. 15 minutes. That triggered calls for investigations into possible insider trading. Someone new or someone coordinated. And while that story slowly unfolds in the financial sections of major newspapers, working families in Phoenix, Houston, Miami, and Los Angeles are paying $4 or $5 per gallon for gasoline without knowing why. The bill is also being paid by the world's poorest countries. The UN World Food Program and multiple economic analysts have warned that the war is driving significant and long-term increases in global food prices. The near-total disruption of tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has disturbed the supply of essential fuel and fertilizers, threatening global food security. The most vulnerable countries in the global south, those least responsible for this war, those with no voice in the decision, are the ones that will suffer the most. Now we need to talk about credibility, because credibility is one of the most important currencies in the international system. Washington's credibility, already damaged by the withdrawal from Afghanistan, erratic foreign policy shifts, and contradictions between words and actions, is being tested once again. The shadow of Afghanistan still lingers over U.S. commitments. Another real or perceived failure could further weaken global security. That assessment was written before the war with Iran began, but it applies perfectly now. If the United States declares victory without achieving its stated objectives, without neutralizing Iran's nuclear program, without sustainably reopening the strait, without establishing a stable peace in the region, then the gap between official rhetoric and reality grows wider. And that gap has consequences. It affects the next diplomatic negotiation, The next alliance Washington tries to build, the next crisis it needs to manage. Among more candid military strategists in Washington, there's a clear understanding. Modern wars are not won with technology alone. Infantry remains decisive. Drones and airstrikes can be devastating, but controlling territory requires soldiers on the ground. U.S. military analysts studying the war in Ukraine have seen that even with technological superiority, without human presence on the ground, territory cannot be controlled. And if that's true in Ukraine, it's just as true in Iran. If that's the case, then Rubio's claim that victory can be achieved without ground troops runs into a serious contradiction with what military professionals themselves are saying behind closed doors. There's another dimension we can't ignore: American public opinion. Even among Republicans, there is growing unease. Representative Derek Van Orden, a former Navy SEAL, told CNN he has specifically advised the administration against any ground presence. Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee added, "I think we need to find an exit strategy as quickly as possible." A former Navy SEAL telling the president not to send troops into Iran. That's not a distant political critic. That's someone who has been in war zones, who understands what it means to deploy forces into unfamiliar and hostile terrain, and who is publicly saying, "Don't do it." That matters. It's a warning signal coming from within the very political bloc that supports Trump. And while all of this unfolds, there is something constant in the background, something the news cycle rarely focuses on because it disrupts the simple narrative of heroes and villains: the human cost. Not the financial cost, the cost in lives. Iranian families who have lost loved ones in airstrikes. Tanker crews killed in drone attacks in the Strait. Working communities in Asian countries suddenly unable to access the gas they need to cook, heat their homes, or power their factories. These are real people, with names, children, and dreams. And on the grand chessboard of geopolitics, they are too often reduced to variables in equations controlled by others. We can't end without asking what all of this means for the world that comes next. Because wars like this don't just have immediate consequences, they have generational ones. The oil crisis of the 1970s, so often used as a comparison, reshaped the global economy, accelerated the shift toward new energy sources, reconfigured international alliances, and left effects that are still felt today. Analysts warn that if between 5 and 10 million barrels per day are lost due to the closure of the strait, the impact could mirror that era. The key message is that an energy transition may be forced, rapidly and painfully. A forced transition, not the planned, gradual, adaptive one, but one imposed by crisis. One that can destroy entire industries overnight and hit hardest those least able to absorb the shock. For Latino communities in the United States, this has very concrete implications. Many families work in sectors highly sensitive to energy prices: transportation, construction, agriculture, manufacturing. When gasoline, diesel, and fertilizers rise, these industries feel it first, and so do the workers within them. It's not abstract. It's the difference between making it to the end of the month or not. The difference between being able to send money to family in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, or Honduras, or not. The difference between stability and constant uncertainty. What we are witnessing is a collision of worlds. The geopolitics of great powers, where decisions are made at the top and costs are pushed onto the most vulnerable. The global economy, where oil remains the lifeblood of the system, and any disruption in a narrow maritime corridor can shake entire continents. And the world of ordinary people, working families, migrants, who don't participate in these decisions but carry their consequences. The question of whether the United States can win this war without ground troops is not the most important one. The central question is, win for whom? And what does winning even mean when gasoline, mortgages, and food prices rise? When the risk of global recession is debated in financial centers, and when any military victory comes at a cost paid not by contractors or investment funds, but by families and workers.